Well, again, the last 3 weeks we've been talking about marriage, any kind of a marriage, and today's scripture reading was that one that was read at Tracy's and my wedding, so it's meaningful to me, and I think as you heard that, I hope that that's one that has meaning for you too. I think they're good words for all relationships, and I think too it's important for me, and I think it's important for you also, that as the choir just sang, that we keep our hearts and our minds stayed on Jesus, that Jesus is at the center of who we are and how we think. And so we're gonna do that today. We're going to talk about how I believe, and many of you believe, that marriage between two people who are the same gender, that are the same sex, is something that can still be honoring of God, as is the case for heterosexual marriage. And I want to be clear that there are probably some of you here today who don't particularly care what the Bible has to say about this, because you know what you believe. One way or the other, you know what you believe. And if the Bible supports that, that's great. And if the Bible doesn't support that, that's okay too. But that's not me. For me, it's important that we take the Bible very seriously. Even the parts that we wish weren't in the Bible, it's important that we take them seriously. And part of the reason that for me this has been something that I've thought carefully about for 20 years, and only in the last 6 or 7 years would truly be somebody who I would consider of myself, at least, only in the last 6 or 7 years, to be somebody who really could be called an advocate, because we need to listen to Scripture carefully. I believe it's still the primary way that God speaks to us today, and I believe it's a legitimate challenge, a legitimate request or challenge for those of us who believe in full equality to find support in the Bible for same-sex marriage. That's a fair challenge. And it's one that I accept, and that's what I want to share with you today. So I want to start by going all the way back to the first scripture passage that was read in the sermon series, back 4 weeks now. And we shared a scripture passage there about the creation story in Genesis chapter 2, when God creates the second human being. And you find that in the 18th chapter of Genesis 2. The verse says, "It's not good that the human is alone. I will make him a helper that is perfect for him." And so then you'll remember that God creates all the animals. And the intent for all of the animals that God creates in this story is that the perfect helper can be found for the first human being. At this point, it's not Adam or Eve. It's just a human. And all of the animals come before the first human one at a time. They're named by the person, and finally, none of them are the right match. And so then we continue to read, and God says that He will make something new that will be the right match. And so God makes another human being. And this is the point at which there's a distinction made for the first time between man and woman. And at this point, Adam says, "This one finally is bone from my bones and flesh from my flesh. She will be called a woman because from a man she was taken." And then it goes on, "This is the reason that a man leaves his father and mother and embraces his wife, and they become one flesh." And of course, becoming one flesh is a euphemism for what it's a euphemism for. And so we'll try to, understanding the children who are here, we'll try to make this something that works, right? All right, so what's the purpose of marriage? What's the purpose of marriage? I gave 3 a few weeks ago, and a couple of those being more primary to the third one, but I want to take you back there again because it's important to get this. And a number of people who are opposed to same-sex marriage, to gay marriage, will say that one purpose of marriage is procreation. And a common argument against this then would be that, well, if that's one of the primary purposes of marriage, then you know how that works, right? So if you've got 2 men or 2 women, you're not going to have procreation. You can't have the primary purpose of marriage cannot be fulfilled. And so whatever a relationship is between 2 men or 2 women, it's not marriage by definition. That's the argument. And I would say if the primary purpose of marriage is reproduction, I think it's a pretty good point. If the primary purpose of marriage is reproduction, then I think we've got to seriously consider biblical marriage as the proper way that marriage is considered. Of course, meaning by biblical marriage, polygamy. because polygamy is the dominant form of marriage in the Bible. And let's face it, I mean, the way that procreation works, your odds are best if you've got a situation where you marry as many women as possible, right? And this is how it works, right? So one could argue that if that's the primary purpose of marriage, then polygamy makes a lot of sense. So does levirate marriage. It's another biblical form of marriage. Levirate marriage is when the husband of a woman passes away, then the woman is automatically married off, given, as property really, given to the brother, the oldest brother of the person of the deceased. And so that makes sure that the woman is still giving birth, right? So this makes sense. If the purpose of marriage is procreation, levirate marriage, we should be all for it. Similarly, in Deuteronomy, we get a justification in the Bible for somebody who rapes a woman to marry her. And it makes sense. If procreation is the primary purpose of marriage, it makes sense. You want that person to be married, they can continue to reproduce, and it doesn't matter who it's to. It doesn't matter how mean the person is, because that's not part of what marriage is about. Marriage is about reproduction. Are you with me? No? You understand what I'm saying? Yeah. All right. But none of those are practiced today. And none of those have been practiced for 2,000 years within Christianity. If the primary purpose of marriage was reproduction, then we wouldn't allow infertile people to be married. If the primary purpose of marriage was reproduction, then anybody who's past reproductive years ought to get divorced. You hear that? That's not good. But that's not the primary purpose of marriage. Let me read this to you again from the 2nd chapter of Genesis, verse 18. It is not good that the human is alone. I will make a helper that will be perfect for him. That's the purpose. To complement each other, to help each other, to be a companion and a partner on the journey. That's the primary purpose of marriage. Oftentimes, reproduction is part of that. But that's not the primary purpose. This is also, as an aside, why if you're in an abusive marriage, an abusive relationship, if you're in an abusive relationship, I don't care what the piece of paper says, it's not a marriage. And you always can get yourself out of that situation. You have permission always to get out of an abusive relationship because it's not, I don't care what the government says, in the eyes of God, it's not a marriage. The covenant's already been broken by the abuser. That person is no longer a helper or a partner. So the question for same-sex marriage is this: can a marriage of two women or two men fulfill the purpose of marriage equally well as a marriage between one woman and one man? And I think the answer is yes. I don't see any reason that our biology prevents us from fulfilling that basic purpose of marriage. It's not good that the human be alone. I will make a helper, I will make a partner that will be perfect for him. That's the purpose. All right, so that's the first step. But there's another question, too, that's a legitimate question. Just because it's possible doesn't mean that it's necessarily ethical. And so what about all those passages in the Bible that condemn homosexuality of any form? Well, a full explanation of those passages is beyond the scope of what we can do today. You have to understand that books are written about this, and I got 20 minutes. So you'll have to excuse me a little bit. But here's what I'd like for you to hear today about this topic. I want you to hear that it is true that the Bible does not give one positive example of a same-sex relationship or of homosexuality, period. But it's also true that the Bible gives no positive examples of interracial marriage. It gives some negative examples. It's something that you're commanded not to do in the Old Testament times. It gives no positive examples of interracial marriage. It gives no positive examples or negative examples, for that matter, of adoption. Anybody opposed to adoption? The Bible's silent on adoption. I mean, here's the deal. Those weren't options back then. If you were a child, you had a family. And the only way that adoption could kind of play into it would be if both of your parents are killed, and then automatically, just like with levirate marriage, it's not even a conversation. You just go to the rest of the family. There was no option for adoption outside of that immediate biological family. Interracial marriage was just not something that you would do. It wasn't even something that would be talked about in the New Testament period. And we can say that with a great deal of certainty that the modern concept of sexual orientation simply did not exist in biblical times. The action, yes. The orientation, there was no conception of that. And specifically at the times of Paul and Jesus, the examples that we have of sexual activity outside of heterosexual marriage would be appalling to any of us. Every person in this room would condemn the actions that people at the time would be familiar with. The best resource for this that I'm aware of, and you can write this down if you want to, a book by Sarah Rudden, R-U-D-E-N, called Paul Among the People. And she talks about a number of the controversial passages that we find in Paul's letters and how Paul deals with women, slaves, people who are gay, a couple of other pieces as well. She talks about how we look at the church, the meaning of the church for Paul. And part of what she does is to just look at the secular literature at the time. And what you find when we understand that first century Roman culture that Paul was in is that sexual acts between the same sex, it was more like prison rape. I mean, there's not a way to sugarcoat it. It was more like prison rape than like an actual mutual relationship. There just was no such thing at the time, at least not that was ever talked about publicly. It was about domination and control. It was not about loving mutual relationships. Stuff that we would all condemn. What we know of today as a same-sex relationship of mutuality and respect simply wasn't heard of. The Bible's silent on that because they didn't know about that. And we can't condemn it because the Bible's silent on it. And without exception, the texts that are traditionally used to condemn any kind of a same-sex act just don't say what we normally today think that they say. That's why it takes interpretation. That's why it takes translation. That's why we have multiple translations of Scripture and why we have all kinds of people who make a living trying to interpret and to understand what the Scripture says for us today. All right. I want you to hear one more thing. I want you to hear that I chose the name of this sermon carefully. It is a biblical case. It is not the biblical case. You can make other arguments from the Bible, and you can make arguments that aren't from the Bible. But this is the case that's meaningful for me, and it's helped me on the journey that I've taken. And I want to lift up to you a couple of these you've already heard, but I want to lift up for you 4 passages from Scripture that I believe help to make a case. The first one, we've talked some about, and you may want to write these down, and we're going to show them to you on the screen as well. You might want to write these down. The first one is from the 2nd chapter of Genesis, verse 18. We've already talked about this one some today. Then the Lord God said, "It's not good that the human is alone. I will make him a helper that is perfect for him." This is what the purpose of marriage is about. The counter-argument to this would be that in Genesis 1, there's a command that humanity be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. And so that's true that Genesis 1 says that. I would suggest that the part about filling the earth we've pretty well done. It's a pretty full place. And significant is that command in Genesis 1, that's a command for all of humanity. That's not a command to Adam and Eve. That's a command for all of as humanity, be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. As humanity, we have done that. But what you have in Genesis 2 is instructions for a specific person. As a person, as an individual, this is what I want for you. Not a command, but a help for an individual. So it's Genesis 1 is for all of humanity. Genesis 2 is for any particular couple. The second passage for you to remember is from 1 Corinthians. This is right from Paul. Paul, in his letter to Romans chapter 1, is a passage that's almost always going to be heard of as a condemning passage. You might also write down just Romans 2, verse 1. At the very end of Romans chapter 1, that's when Paul mentions homosexuality. And then people stop reading at the end of chapter 1 because of verse 1 of chapter 2 says, therefore do not condemn lest you be condemned. So you might write that down as well. But 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 9, I encourage you to read the whole passage, but verses 8 and 9 sum it up. I'm telling those of you who are single and widows that it's good for them to stay single like me. Paul says the best situation would be to be single. But then he goes on, if they can't control themselves, you understand what he means, right? If they can't control themselves, they should get married, because it's better to marry than to burn with passion. Now again, orientation is not the issue here. Paul doesn't know what orientation is. Orientation is different from action, but when it comes to the action, Paul says, if you can't control yourself, then be married. I can't for the life of me think of any reason why we would think that that would apply to one orientation and not the other. If Paul thinks that for your own sake you should be married, then why would we not say to anybody, for your own sake you should be married? Now, in this regard, I happen to be somebody who's actually pretty traditional. I think that the gift of sex is a gift that's made for a monogamous lifetime relationship. I believe in marriage. I want everybody to be married. If you want to be married, I want you to be married in a way that's going to be helpful for you. And I think that's what Paul's saying here. 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 9, in particular verses 8 and 9. The third passage for me is the 22nd chapter of Matthew, verses 34 to 40. It's one of two places where the great commandment appears in the Gospels. As with last week, and Sandra preached last week on divorce, and you'll remember the passage that was read from Matthew, the Pharisees challenged Jesus, and they're not really asking him a question about divorce. They're actually just trying to get him tied into a no-win situation with his response. The same thing is true here with this as well. The Pharisees are talking to Jesus. They're trying to mess him up, and he will not allow himself to be messed up. And so they ask him, what's the greatest commandment? Verses 34 to 40 gives the entire answer, or the entire story. But Jesus' answer is in these 4 verses of 37 to 40. You must love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. You must love your neighbor as you love yourself. All the law and the prophets depend on these 2 commands. Now, those are 2 commands that separately from each other were already in the Jewish faith. We find those in other places in the Bible. But what Jesus did was to put those together and to say, they're like 2 sides of the coin. You can't do one without the other. They go hand in hand. And then most significantly, Jesus says, basically he's saying, if you don't remember anything else, remember this. Love God with all that you got, and love your neighbor as yourself. In Luke's gospel, he goes into the story of the Good Samaritan at this point, but as an example for us. And then that last sentence, all the law and the prophets depend on these 2 commands. And when he says the law and the prophets, basically what he's saying is everything that you've read in what we today call the Old Testament, all that boils down to this. Love God and love your neighbor. Love God and love your neighbor. And there's debate, even still today, there's debate among biblical scholars about how the law in the Old Testament applies to us today. People have broken, including John Wesley, people have broken down that law into ceremonial law, basically cultural law, and moral law, saying that the moral law is the one that holds for all time. But there's never, in my reading, there's never been a satisfactory explanation for why one law is a moral law and one law is not. So we might say that this is a moral law, but not eating pork. You're familiar with that? Not eating pork, that's a cultural law or a ritual or ceremonial law, not a moral law. Well, why? And we might be able to give a reason why, but there's not a biblical reason why. If you want to go by the Bible, that distinction is never actually made, that I can find, that distinction is never actually made in the Bible between which laws are which. And so what Jesus, in my opinion, what Jesus is saying here is it doesn't matter how you categorize those things, because the bottom line is whatever you read, whatever you are thinking about doing, here's the fundamental question. All the law and the prophets depend on these two commands, that you love God and that you love your neighbor as yourself. Are you doing that? And when I think about people who are gay today, people who have any kind of an orientation other than just the standard traditional orientation that we know about, it's often called cisgender, is how that's referenced. When we think about that today, there's people whose lives are at stake. There's people who have taken their own life because they've tried to pray the gay away, and it doesn't work because they are who they are. There's people whose lives are at stake. And I just can't fathom how rejecting those individuals, because that's how they experience it, I can't fathom how rejecting those individuals falls in line with loving God and loving our neighbor like ourselves. I just can't get there. So for me, this passage from Matthew, fulfilling that great commandment, is an important piece for me. And then finally, the place where we started today with the 3rd chapter of Colossians, verses 12 through 17, the model for us of marriage of any kind, really the model for us of relationship of any kind. Colossians chapter 3, verses 12 through 17, as God's chosen ones, holy and beloved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, meekness, and patience.